Altium Designer uses the concept of design rules to define the requirements of a design. Now, these rules would essentially form an instruction set for the PCB to follow. We'll first be configuring some common basic design rules for our drone project. The rules in Altium Designer are set up using the PCB Rules and Constraints Editor, which can be found in the Design menu under Rules from the PCB Editor. All of the design rules are categorized on the left side of this interface, and each category would contain a subcategory of rules. Let's first expand the electrical category, then expand the clearance subcategory, and you'll notice a single clearance rule. It's worth noting that for each essential design rule, it'll always need at least one rule associated to it. Once you select the clearance rule, the current rule settings are displayed on the right-hand side, and this interface can be broken down into two main areas. The upper area is where we would determine which objects we want the rule to target. We can apply it to one set of objects or against multiple objects. We'll be diving into these options a little later on. The lower area is the constraints area, and this is where we would set the values for the rule itself. So under the constraints area, let's set the minimum clearance to 0.1 millimeters and ensure that we're targeting different nets only. If you need to toggle between units, you can use the Control Q shortcut keys to toggle between metric and imperial units. This rule would now mean that any electrical objects in the list below that have different nets will need a minimum clearance of 0.1 millimeters to avoid any errors in our PCB. If you wanted to change the clearance for individual items in the list below, you can click on the cell and change the value manually. Go ahead and click Apply at the bottom of the dialog to save the settings for this rule. We'll now expand the routing section to configure the width rules. Expand the width subcategory and select the default width rule. For track width, you can set the minimum, preferred, and maximum for every layer of your PCB. Common traces for our PCB will be routed at a 0.15 millimeter width, so we'll set the minimum width to 0.1 millimeters, the preferred width to 0.15 millimeters, and the max width to 1 millimeter. As a side note, you may want to have a discussion with your PCB manufacturer to see what their limitations are in regards to minimum track widths or other limitations that they may have. Recall previously that we created a net class that contained power nets, so we'll be creating an additional width rule specific for that class. Right-click on the default width rule, select New Rule, and you'll notice a new rule will appear with the name of width_1. Let's select this rule as we need to configure it. We'll first click on the drop-down menu under Where the Object Matches and select Net Class. In the drop-down just to the right, we'll select Power, so this will limit the rule to that net class only. Since these power nets may have a higher current level passing through them, we'll want to make sure that the minimum track width is a little larger. So we'll set the minimum width to 0.2 millimeters, the preferred width to 0.4 millimeters, and the max width to 1 millimeter. And lastly, we'll want to change the default name as it can be hard to distinguish from the other rules in this category. So let's enter a new name of width_power in the name field. When you're done, click Apply at the bottom of the dialog to save the rule. It's also common to configure a rule for via sizing as well. Still under the routing category, you'll find the routing via style subcategory with the routing vias rule. Assuming that our PCB manufacturer can comply with our settings, we'll change the via diameter and hole size values for the default rule. Ensure that you're using the same values as we're showing and hit Apply when you're finished. Previously, we've configured a differential pair from the schematic, and the routing for this pair usually requires special attention and configuration. So let's expand the differential pairs routing category. It may happen that you've added an additional rule by accident and want to delete it. It's as easy as right-clicking on the rule itself and click Delete Rule. It'll now be crossed out and you can hit Apply to remove it completely. We'll now be working with the default diff pairs routing rule. When we configured the Layer Stack Manager, we created an impedance profile for differential nets. This is where we can apply the profile to our net pair. Make sure that you enable the Use Impedance Profile box in the Constraints region. The width values will then be updated based on the specific impedance of the profile. Simply click Apply to save these settings. That's it for the rules that apply to routing. Now we need to configure a few fabrication rules for mask and paste expansion along with component clearance. Let's first expand the mask category, then open the solder mask expansion subcategory to find the default rule. Let's set the expansion top value to 0.1 millimeters. Also make sure that the link between the expansion top and bottom is enabled to apply the same value to both. You'll notice that the bottom value will then be grayed out, and you can now click Apply to save the rule configuration. Just below the solder mask rule, let's expand the paste mask expansion rule. In order to improve the solderability of components, it's sometimes recommended to set the paste expansion smaller than the pad size. So we'll set the expansion value to negative 0.05 millimeters and click Apply. The last rule we'll configure in this video is the component clearance rule, specifically the rule of vertical and horizontal clearance between components. From the placement category, let's expand the component clearance subcategory, and you'll see the default rule for component clearance. Let's set the minimum horizontal clearance to 0.05 millimeters and the minimum vertical clearance to 0.1 millimeter. One thing to keep in mind whenever you have multiple rules per category is to double check the priority of each rule. The priority will decide which rule is applied first, and some rules may not apply if they're not properly prioritized. Click Apply when you're done, then click OK to close the PCB Rules editor. The design rules are a part of the PCB document, so go ahead and save the PCB so you don't lose any changes made to the design rules.